welcome to our second EPRC webinar of the autumn series. My name is Martin Ferry, and I'm a researcher here at the European Policies Research Centre, and we're happy to welcome you all to this webinar. Especially we welcome our presenter, who's Rebecca Baugh from the European Policies Research Centre, who will discuss co-creating urban development, so using language to unlock and value the unconventional. The presentation will last for about 30 minutes. Then we'll have an opportunity for discussion. We can open the floor to questions and comments from the audience in the remaining time. If you'd like to make an intervention, please use the Zoom raise a hand function or the chat function, and we can pick these questions up after the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to inform you that the meeting is being recorded, which means that you and colleagues will have the opportunity to follow the meeting at a later stage. With that, I'd like to quickly present our speaker today. So, as I said, Rebecca Baugh is a research assistant here at EPRC. She's contributing to our Interreg Europe Commit project. She has a background in architecture and urbanism. She completed both a bachelor's and a master's degree at TU Delft. Amongst other themes and topics, her work explores languages, so written, spoken, visual, body and silence and otherwise, and how this can be used to best engage diverse groups. So co-creative participation, particularly in urban planning, design, and spatial literacy in terms of building and planning. This touches on intersectionality in urban analysis, but overall the core of Rebecca's work and interest is exploring how collectively there can be creation of a safer, more free, just environment where a range of people can feel heard, feel safe and feel valued. So this is the broad context within which Rebecca will make the presentation. But I'd like to hand over to Rebecca now to make that presentation. Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you for the introduction, Martin. Thank you to Martin, and thank you to everyone who's come today, and also Marina for organising. I'm just going to share my screen now. Just give me one moment. Okay. Can you see a full screen presentation currently? Yeah, okay, great. So without further ado, we'll get stuck into the presentation now. And just building on to the introduction that Martin gave to who I am, I just want to go over some of my personal research values when it comes to urban development, when it comes to policy, architecture, urbanism. And there are three main ones. So they include curiosity, being interested, to learn more, care about those who I'm working with and this theme or subject that we're working on, and lastly, reciprocity, and to ensure that there's mutual benefit throughout. And you'll notice some of these values actually throughout the presentation, as they were very much formed by this project. And without further ado, I'm going to present an outline for today, and you'll see that there are numbers 1 to 5. And essentially, these numbers 1 to 5 read more as various layers that will actually build on and deepen from the layer before. So we'll begin with the project context, so that you know where this project took place, the different methods that were used, some of the resulting themes as they are presented in their tangible forms, and then also some of the themes that are intangible, a little bit harder to understand. And then we have our overarching theme, what it means to be seen. So let's dive into the project context. So as Martin said, this project, I was a former student. I'm an alumna of TU Delft's architecture and urbanism program, and this was a master's thesis that I did as part of the planning complex cities studio. And we'll begin with the problematization, so the hierarchies that influence this dream, and you can see it here, this dream of socio-spatial justice and how to make this a reality. So the problem field really concerns this idea of them versus us, which is a somewhat natural phenomenon when an individual and oftentimes a collective's perception of the world consists of an in-group, us, and an out-group, them. Them and us thinking can manifest in many, many different ways. And I've presented two hierarchies here for you today in how that challenge and actually make it more difficult to achieve this dream of socio-spatial justice. So they relate to the hierarchy of caste and class, which caste specifically is a term that you may be familiar and have heard in South Asian contexts, but is actually one that is very relevant to the European city that we will talk to later on, Rotterdam, but also the Western Europe in general, where in caste hierarchies, we typically have those of European descent, those who are financially wealthy, are atheist or Christian, who are deemed as the dominant force to civilize in quoted brackets, inferior indigenous peoples of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, who are perceived to be unenlightened, resulting in their knowledge systems being easily dismissed. In tandem, there was a hierarchy between working, middle, and upper classes that worked to further separate various people. And alongside this hierarchy of caste and class, the research really explores hierarchies of expertise. So in hierarchies of expertise, we have expert planners, expert designers, expert policymakers at the top, while we get progressively lower to low-income migrants, where there is a perceived invalidity or inferiority of this non-expert knowledge and these fields, which very much translate to urban planning. Which you can see in the case of apartheid models in South Africa, or redlining and residential segregation in parts of the US, as well as in the Netherlands, where I currently am as well. I won't go into that too much now, but if you have any questions in the discussion portion of the session, please do let me know. And the danger of these hierarchies is that they lead to a single paradigm being used. So there's a massive amount of diverse and rich knowledge that we could be using to contribute to socio-spatial justice that is left by the wayside. And then we also continue to perpetuate these cycles of gentrification. So now I introduce Rotterdam and the specific neighborhood in which this history thesis took place, which is in Bosbolder Tussendijke. So it's a western neighborhood of Rotterdam. It's very close to some of the older ports in Rotterdam, and also home to a rich diversity of residents and employees with backgrounds from Cape Verde, from Turkey, from Suriname, from the Netherlands, other parts of the Netherlands in the south, but it's very rich in its diversity in that sense. It's also characterized by somewhat lower income level than the rest of Rotterdam, and therefore it was very ample to do the research here in terms of the various hierarchies that impact socio-spatial justice, which can be defined as the right to a city's resources, how it develops and it evolves, and how it can be used. So this is just a brief context of where it's located in Rotterdam. I also did this project in collaboration with the Academy, which is a research institute based in Rotterdam South, and they're a part of the municipality of Rotterdam. And now, just to cover some of the central aims of the project. So the first aim, as Martin mentioned in his introduction, is for the urbanist or the researcher, the policymaker, to become this language mediator. where they really become multilingual in how to use spoken language, written language, visual language, as well as body and emotions and silence to ensure that people feel engaged and welcome to contribute their ideas. Nelson Mandela has a famous quote: if you speak to a man in a language he understands, you speak to his mind. But if you speak to a man in his language, you speak to his heart. So this is where this idea of using language to engage with people, which very much relates to recent developments regarding storytelling and the importance of storytelling in planning, design, and policy. Then we move on to the second aim, which regards accessing and valuing the unconventional. So this can include unconventional knowledge, as well as experiences and skills. Oftentimes, faculties such as the one I studied at TU Delft, the architecture faculty, can be seen as this bastion of knowledge regarding the built environment. However, there are other places like barbershops, like nurseries, like churches that people gather in where they feel comfortable to tell their stories and to share, that we can use and incorporate into various processes as they relate to urban development. And lastly, we have the third aim, which is building citizen literacy. So this is to ensure that not only citizens have a voice at the table, but they also have an informed and empowered one when they're sitting around it. So with all of that in mind, I'm just going to go through a brief overview of some of the ethical considerations, as it was highly important for a project where there was a lot of interaction with various people. So as I said before, in terms of one of my personal values, but also related to research fatigue, there needed to be mutual benefit for not only myself as the researcher and the project aims, but also the communities that I was interacting with. As we're talking about these hierarchies and these quite static hierarchies that have existed for decades, for centuries, that are static, as I've just mentioned, there wasn't an opportunity to be neutral. Then a stand did need to be taken. So it's also acknowledging when that needs to take place, related to mutual benefit, that there's empowerment for the community, data is protected, and lastly, my positionality. So understanding how I fit within these various hierarchies and systems. And without further ado, now we get into some of the methods. This is an overview of all of the different methodologies that we use to respond to each of the research aims. So whether that be language, whether that be about access and value, literacy building, what you can see here is that there are at least 3 different methods, whether that be multimedia review, observation, or semi-structured interviews, that informed the responses to each of the aims. I'm not going to go too much into this, but I am going to go into some of the key takeaways from this methodological approach in terms of how questions were asked and phrased and formulated. So as opposed to very complex questions that help to encapsulate multi-layered ideas, the questions that I asked to the various residents and employees and just passers-by in this Rotterdam West neighborhood were fairly simple. So they consisted of, what does community mean to you? What does home mean to you? What places do you feel safe, for example? And although these questions are very short in nature, they were broad and engaging enough that various participants would go on for not just 10 minutes, but sometimes 3 hours answering these questions with a massive amount of enthusiasm and also consideration for how they were answering. They were very incredibly engaged. Even though these questions were simple, they were quite profound in the answers and the responses that they would inspire. And also, you may have noticed in 2 slides previous that there were semi-structured interviews, and over the course of time, these really morphed into fluid conversations. So as opposed to having my checklist of questions from 1 to 10, I had a range of questions, which you saw in the previous slide, that I wanted to ask. But these questions sometimes went from 1 to 4 and round in messy, not necessarily linear ways. And although participants may have gone off on tangents sometimes, it was really important and something to highlight in terms of research, policymakers, urbanists, is when people do go off on tangents, is that there can be very valuable information that they're sharing that can help create a wider context for fuller understanding of what is happening in their system, in their community, their region, their neighborhood. And so it's a really valuable skill for us as researchers, as policymakers, to be able to transition from these interviews to these fluid conversations and not be afraid of information that might seem irrelevant at first, but actually helps us understand more fully. And now we'll go into some of the themes. So as you saw, there were 3 central aims for this research. And as opposed to answering each aim separately, there were various themes that intertwined to respond to the different aims in various ways. So I'm going to present these themes to you now in their tangible form. So these are some things that you can feel, that you can maybe implement more easily. And they include differentiated engagement. So for example, one participant explained how he feels safe and at home in an environment that welcomes him. So this is an example of a Moroccan Dutch participant walking down the road in this Rotterdam West neighborhood, where he can see a barber shop, where he could see a toko, which is a Surinamese Indonesian supermarket where he can buy different food that is familiar, is nostalgic to him, where he sees an Avondwinkel, which is similar to a British off-license shop or a convenience store in the States, but where he can see different parts of the environment that reflect who he is, having grown up in these multicultural spaces, and where he can see his reflection and is also welcomed by his environment. So that's an opportunity for us to also differentiate and explore the different places that we can engage people, so they don't necessarily have to be in a faculty or in a research institute, but that can take place in a bakery, in a supermarket, in an off-license shop, in an internet cafe. There's a plethora of spaces that this can occur. And this really relates to multisensory engagement. So as human beings, we have multiple senses. We are affected by the sounds of our environment, the smells. And several participants mentioned, for example, when they hear certain music, they feel like this is their place. They are welcomed to come into this environment and to share, to talk. And oftentimes this includes the sharing of skills, of experiences and knowledge. But this can also take place in terms of spices. But it's really identifying, where do people feel at home? Where do they feel safe, and where do they feel in community and safe enough to speak and to share? And this also relates to the different ways of occupying space. So some participants mentioned how they enjoy engaging in large groups, while others said that they prefer more intimate settings. And this can also relate to how people sit and occupy space. So whether they're sitting around a table, sitting down on the floor on bean bags, taking off their shoes before they enter a space, but this can also all affect how welcome, how comfortable they feel in a certain given environment. So it's really for us to identify, what types of places are these? And as I mentioned before, this idea of reciprocity is this idea of hospitality and generosity. So that can include, for example, in this Rotterdam West neighborhood, doing my local grocery shopping there, even though I lived in a different city. That could include going to a cafe and having drinks and just having tea and just having conversations with the employees and passers-by casually, and ensuring that I'm not just taking and extracting information from them, which is also relates to this hierarchy of caste, where some groups are extracted from, without anything necessarily being given back to them, but it ensures this reciprocity and mutual benefit. And it also This also then contributes to this idea of differentiated engagement in terms of time. So, for example, oftentimes engagement takes place during workshops that can last from 1, sometimes 3 hours, sometimes a whole day, but not necessarily everybody who we would want to engage to ensure that diversity has that type of time freedom. And so what can happen is that there can be variations in conversation length. So for example, when speaking to employees in the service industry, so in a cafe or in a supermarket, I couldn't speak to them for 2 hours straight, but instead we had these 5-minute conversations intermittently over a 2-hour period. This also meant that sometimes I would have 10 or 20-minute conversations with multiple people during an information hour, for example, or we could have longer sit-down meetings that were an hour. And we still have those workshops that are longer, but we can differentiate the time and the conversation length that we are engaging with people. And this similarly relates to how often we relate to people. So this can be on a weekly basis, on a monthly basis, but these continued interactions really help with the next part, which is deepening relationships and really establishing this level of trust between those whom we're working with, whether that be as planners, as designers, or policymakers. So, for example, for a period of 12 months, and actually still to this day, I go to this Rotterdam West neighborhood on a weekly basis, where I greet some of the people, some of the residents that I know. We have small, short conversations about how we're doing, just to build that relationship, which allows people to be more free with what they share. And again, increasing our pool of what knowledge and experiences we can access. And in terms of acknowledgement and greetings and respect, I'd spoken about in the methods some of the questions that I asked, but equally it was important to really observe. And this idea of observation has been quite critical to research when it comes to people participation and interaction. So there are different ways of showing respect, of showing acknowledgement, of familiarity, and interest and curiosity. So for example, this is a handshake that then proceeds where you touch your heart as a way of saying, I see you, as several participants commented. Now we move on to the intangible themes. And as I presented to you just now, the tangible themes, these intangible themes actually underpin. So I spoke about this idea of layering before. So in layer 4, we go a little bit deeper as these layers, as the intangible actually inform what we think. And what I mean by this is really our mindset and this idea of mindset shift. So I present to you now a standard world map. And if you can on your screens, if you can just annotate the screen and point out where Cape Verde is for me, please. I'll give you a few seconds to do that. Or you can pinpoint it in your head. Has everyone? Yes. Sophia, Liliana. Great. And have you seen this map before? This type of map before? Yes? Okay, great. If you could remove your annotations. Thank you. And I'd like you to do the same on this map. Please, can you identify where Cape Verde is? Again, by annotating the screen. Yes, I see a little fewer answers than in the first map. And with these examples of the map that I'm showing you is this idea of a mindset shift. So in the standard example, it was very easy to pinpoint, or easier to pinpoint, where Cape Verde is, but this map completely distorts the way we we think, and it forces us to think in a different way, to perhaps understand a different picture, a different image, a different way of the world being connected. And this is something that was very important for the intangible themes that were explored during the research. So by delving into that a little bit more, and something that underpins the research is actually this idea of hierarchy. But with these intangible themes, it became very important, as several of the participants said, to really examine what hierarchies existed and how these contributed to various levels of power. So many participants explained how in interactions with the Rotterdam municipality, how they felt that the municipality could be quite condescending towards them, even silencing them at times. And this was different based when they engaged with more local council governments who they had more frequent contact with. They expressed how they had more trust in these individuals, in these collectives at the local government level within the neighborhood. But because the municipality were more distant, they were less visible, there was a greater power imbalance and asymmetry. So these intangible themes also prompt us and encourage us to be okay with being uncomfortable and to recognize how our positionality influences interactions that we have with people, and how this can actually either limit or allow for more fruitful exchanges. So again, these mindset shifts can allow the opportunity for more nuance for understanding. So again, we're presented with this image of a Moroccan Dutch participant walking down a street in one part of Rotterdam where he feels incredibly stigmatized because of his appearance, like he shouldn't be there, versus in another more diverse area where he feels very much embraced by those around him. And with this, some of the participants highlighted the two main destroyers of trust, which include neglect and condescension. But they also spoke about some of the building blocks for trust, which include a welcoming smile, safety, visibility, protection, actively listening, and also supporting. So that could even be by doing your grocery shopping or going to a cafe as you go about research. And this brings me to the final section, or the final layer, which is the overarching theme, what it means to be seen. So both these tangible and intangible themes really contribute to what it means to be seen in terms of language. So how can visual, spoken, written, body language and silence really ensure that people feel welcomed into a space? It also relates to how knowledge is recognized in unconventional places, and also to build someone's confidence in their own skills and ability. And what this can do in terms of Rotterdam is that in every environment, there's a different person mix. There are different groups of people. So for example, in Rotterdam, these are two images of Rotterdam and Amsterdam with the 7 most prominent ethnic groups in the different environments. And so here you can see that there are literally different soils for remixing, for innovation, for learning, for knowledge exchange, for knowledge building, just based on the different backgrounds of the people that exist within these communities. And this is specifically regarding ethnic background, but this can also include profession and a plethora of other social identities. So in Delfshaven, as you can see in some of these photos here of signs in restaurants and supermarket windows, that some of the shops would be closed for the entirety of the summer period, as people would be going back to Morocco, to Turkey, to London, to Croatia, where they have family. And so there's this opportunity to access a group who spend quite a lot of time in another part of the world experiencing, who then come back to the Netherlands and can actually use this knowledge to inform what they do in their local environment. Then, in terms of funding, we speak of the cohesion policy and strengthening the economic, social, and territorial cohesion, is that in this Rotterdam West neighborhood, several communities, whether they be sort of a Syrian community, a Turkish community, but this also exists in the UK with many Caribbean communities, where they have a community pot with various members who can contribute €10 a month, for example, and then one person gets that, gets all of those contributions for the month, for 1 month, and then the same is done the next month, but then the money is passed around to another person. So there are also different ways of funding projects that could take place in urban environments. There can also be increased nuance through mixing and through seeing all of these differences, similarities of the people that we're interacting with. So this is in the case of spoken language in this Rotterdam West neighborhood, and there were a plethora. You can see here there are also a plethora of different alphabets that are used, but it really speaks to how language is a toolbox for our understanding and our expression of our experiences in the world. And so by leaning in on different languages, this is an example of spoken language, but this can also apply to many other forms, we can actually build our toolbox of nuance. For example, one word may exist in English, whereas a sentence may exist in Dutch to translate that one word. So here we have more nuance and we have more to build on. It can also create new identities. So for example, here, this is just sort of an electricity box on the street that two shop owners then decided to use as a table where people would gather and drink coffee and things like that. We also have another example to the right where we have the shop extending onto the street, which actually causes us to move and meander and be on our way in a different way. It forces not just a mindset shift in how we subconsciously sometimes move on the pavement, but also changes how we move physically. And so I'm just going to go into one last example of how what it means to be seen was translated in the Rotterdam West neighborhood. So this is a map that you may typically see in the architectural and urbanism field, which many participants commented was very abstract and they had no idea what these numbers indicated, nor what these grey or white patches represented. And this was a map that was actually used to highlight where different residents could go to get support on whatever matters they needed support with. And so during an information hour that lasted from 9 to 1 o'clock, while people were waiting to speak to the various consultants, I sat there and asked the various participants how they could actually improve this map. How would they be able to be seen in such an image and actually use it as an instrument to expand our collective understanding and also as an instrument for exchange between residents and urbanists, policymakers, planners, designers. And so with this, they highlighted that the map should include public transport options. They should also include landmarks such as McDonald's, supermarkets, football, stadiums, street names. They also mentioned how it was helpful to have a ground floor plan, so a bird's eye view of the local area, but they also wanted an image of the front facade because they don't experience space from above, they experience space from the street level. And so with that, we created this map, this instrument to be used and to really expand our thinking on the different ecosystems here, which you can see, for example, of different eateries and food establishments where people gather, where they felt at home, safe, and in community. And this is very much a continual process throughout what it means to be seen as a continual process, incorporating both tangible and intangible themes that is underpinned by active curiosity and care. And with that, I bring the end to my presentation. Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for I think a really thought-provoking and informative presentation. I think it certainly raises a number of important issues in terms of accessing or generating valuable local knowledge as part of contemporary policy and planning processes. I think it's really raised a lot of really important issues from that point of view. We have a chance now, a bit of time, if anyone would like to come in to pick up specific points or raise questions or observations. Please feel free to come in now. You can raise a hand or indicate in some other way. Okay, I can then take I can then take advantage of being chair to come in with it's a question and well, kind of an observation as well, Rebecca. This comes from the research that we are carrying out in the Horizon project, DUST, in thinking about how we can involve less engaged communities in sustainable transition measures that are happening in their territories. And one of the challenges that we see is finding the time and the space on the policy side to do these valuable participatory processes. These things to unlock or generate this sort of local knowledge takes time and takes space to do. And if you think about, for example, the European Commission's Just Transition Fund, it works against a pretty tight timeline for doing things, for accessing the funding and getting it spent. So I just wonder, you know, from your experience, that if there are any insights of how this this dilemma can be approached. So thanks. That's one question.
Yes, thank you for your question, Martin. So as a part of some of the intangible themes that I spoke about, centrally was this idea of mindset shift. And so the current systems and processes that we've often developed, they really work to do what we've perhaps done in the past. But if we're wanting to explore this world of participation, that will also require different behaviors from us. And as I showed in one of the schemes here, I will just share my screen again to help answer the question. Ooh. There could be other different time periods in which we engage people depending on the conversation length. But ultimately there is a mindset shift that is required, not just at an institution, well, not just at a personal level or an individual level, but also at an institutional level. And there's quite an interesting case study that extrapolates on this idea a little bit more. And it took place in South Africa, where they had two different towns who had the same or similar goals for their urban development and over a period of 10 years. And with one town, so we'll call it Town A, they adopted a very traditional model of sort of a top-down model of this is what we're going to be doing. We'll tell the residents that this is what's going to happen. And then in Town B, they adopted this asset-based community development approach, so the ABCD approach, where they would identify what community members had a certain type of knowledge or experience or skill that could actually lend to urban development. And they found that over the period of 2 years, Town A, so the town who had adopted the more traditional approach, had was very much on the way to fulfilling their goals. Everything was very neat, very tidy. Whereas Town B, it was just absolute havoc and chaos. They were still trying to determine and identify who had this skill, who had another type of knowledge that could be used. It was just complete havoc. But what they found after a 10-year period is that Town A, who had adopted a more traditional top-down approach, not where engagement wasn't very central, is that they had to start again when the planning sort of trajectory for the next 10 years changed. They had to start from the beginning, whereas Town B, who had undergone this very messy process over a 10-year period, they had identified who could do what, and then therefore build on, even when aims changed, when the different contexts changed. So I think it's a mindset shift that's required at all levels of society and planning. But there are ways, small ways, in which we can engage in terms of, varying our conversation length, also being based in the area that we're researching in for extended amounts of time, so that we can have these non-official interviews or conversations, but just casual interactions that really help to build this trust and this visibility. They're very helpful for engagement. Yeah.
Thanks, Rick. I mean, I think that's a really useful response. Thinking more broadly about, particularly your point about this, if you like, front loading of an investment of time and resources in setting up these processes or systems for longer term benefits. I think we see this in different policy areas as well, where there is an investment to be made at the early stage, but long term benefits, stretching. You're building capacity at the local level to do this.
Precisely. And so it's, I've heard the term demand-driven policies, which are fairly short-term, and you can hear that from their name, but there are ways to build that capacity and to stretch that capacity so that we can keep building the building, as opposed to having to rebuild the foundations every 10 years when aims or the trajectory changes.
I suppose it's just important to convince politicians and policymakers to accept this sort of timescale and the sort of the longer term. Thanks. Okay, does anyone else have a question or a point or an observation to raise? I see Nellie's made herself visible, so thanks, Nellie.
Yes, thanks, Rebecca. It was very interesting to listen to you, and it's a great presentation visually. I was wondering very practically, as during your research, you said that you also needed to find your place within these hierarchies that are experienced. And I was wondering, how did participants perceive you in the research process? Did they see you as this expert that is coming to learn something and then bring that into planning or policy, or did they see you as someone more equal to them? Did you try to present yourself more as I'm part of your community, I'm a community member, or I am here because I have certain understanding of planning and I can help change things? And maybe a second question, if there's time. I was wondering, because you were talking about these diverse ethnicities that are in the neighborhood, and of course it's important to have this trust between policy practitioners or planners and citizens, but I was also wondering if you had any observations in terms of how these ethnicities perceived each other. Did they trust each other? Did they want to actually participate together, or was it actually difficult to imagine a process where these different cultures can sit together?
Thank you for both of your questions, Nellie. I'll respond to the first one in terms of how did I present myself when I was in this Rotterdam West neighborhood. I'm not from this Rotterdam West neighborhood, nor did I live there. So I didn't necessarily present myself as a community member, but I certainly presented myself as somebody who was interested in learning about the neighborhood, but also about the different individuals that I was speaking to specifically. So there was lots of questions of just how are you? Let's establish this just human relationship. But I presented myself, yes, as a curious person who was different in many ways. I'm neither Dutch, but there are similarities between the context that I come from and the context that I was working in. So I try to identify those and then use those as a link to build rapport with the people that I was interacting with. So I didn't try to sort of fit in, but I did try to identify and pretend that I was from the area, but I did identify where there were similarities are, and I call it same but different, and then ask questions and build a rapport from there. And sort of related to what you asked in terms of how I presented myself, and I spoke before about the need to become uncomfortable. In the initial stages of the research, when I was going up to people and talking to them and building these relationships, I noticed that I was only approaching women for the longest time, and I was like, oh my gosh, I have no responses from any men or anything like that. So there was a level of self-awareness that I needed to have, sometimes in hindsight as well. In the beginning, I just didn't realize that was my bias to approach certain groups of people. But it made me a bit uncomfortable to think about how I was doing that. But it was very important to get a more well-rounded view. So I think that there was a level of self-awareness as well that is necessary to engage in this type of research. And then how did the various ethnicities perceive each other? So there was an image, maybe I can just quickly share it here. So there's an image here of a Dutch Moroccan participant walking down the street, and the barbershop and the beauty salon or the bakery, the toko, which is Surinamese, Indonesian type of supermarket, the internet cafe, the avondwinkel, which is like an off-license shop in the UK, or a convenience store. They're not necessarily things that are stereotypically Moroccan, but they are, excuse me, they are familiar to many of the residents who had grown up in this area, which was very diverse. So they grew up with this diversity. Even in terms of the language that they used, you would hear words from Sarantongo, which is from Suriname, as well as Arabic words being used by people who weren't necessary or didn't have backgrounds or connections to these different parts of the world. So there was definitely this amalgamation of different ethnicities just in the way people speak, in terms of the slang that was innovated here by these different groups, particularly younger generations. But there was interaction. There were also differences, but there was interaction and a wanting to live side by side with each other. At times, there were also instances where sort of people coming into the area didn't necessarily know anyone in the area, and so they were a bit more reserved, but they were still interested in learning more. So it was a mixed bag, but as you can see in this image, this area was very diverse anyway, and so people grew up innovating and taking from this culture, from that culture, to create something new.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. We still have a couple of minutes left. If anyone else would like to raise a point. Okay. Yes, Niels, thank you.
Hi,
Please
I
feel
hope,
free.
hope you can hear me. Thank you for this
Yes.
interesting presentation. I have also a methodological question. As you mentioned, you also were aware of aspects like body language and feelings and so on. So how did you deal with those very fuzzy, very subjective aspects of those data? And how did you integrated this in your research process, in your analytical process?
Mm-hmm. So, as you saw during the presentation, there was this scheme of the conversation frequency, so how often I was in the area. And I would often just observe what was happening around me. And then as I had just had these casual conversations with many of the residents in the area, I slowly began to build rapport, which meant that if there were areas of fuzziness or I wasn't sure, I would ask. And it would be acceptable to ask them directly. Sometimes I would also Google if it was particularly sensitive, but oftentimes because rapport was built, I would be able to ask quite freely. And in terms of so that's one main thing, is the frequency that I was in the area to build this connection. And there was one instance that there was an image of a greeting where you shake hands, you sort of fist bump, and then you place your hand on your heart. And I wasn't familiar with it at first, but then I simply asked either participants in the community in the Rotterdam West neighborhood itself, or participants who, or people I knew who had similar backgrounds, what it meant. And so, yeah, I think there's much value in the simplicity of just asking questions, and asking questions also as simply as possible, with a tone of curiosity. So this comes back to body language and spoken language, in terms of just having that expressed in our voice, as opposed to like, why are you doing this, in a more accusatory way. I was very conscious as to what my body language was like. And then in terms of the analytical approach, so and how that related to body language, there was a lot of flip-flopping between field work and then reading about different cultures, again, asking questions about different cultures and how they interact, what was acceptable. For example, in some cases, I wouldn't necessarily what was respectable as well, respectful. I wouldn't necessarily shake hands with certain groups. So there was a lot of back and forth between field work and not necessarily desk research, but research that you would typically do at a table. And there was a blurring of that line. There didn't need to be a very distinct distinction. It was okay to let it flow naturally.
Thank you. Because I mean, at the end, it's in the heart of the debate on who has the right to the city, or isn't it? Because where do you feel safe? So who makes urbanity, isn't it? So I mean, you could say city is made by planner, and urbanity is made by people in the neighborhoods, isn't it? So, and it's worth it to think about how to analyze those feelings and so on, those fuzzy aspects, as this is actually the key to a living neighborhood, isn't it?
But very much so. And in some of the examples, you could see how, particularly in Delfshaven, planning by nature is interactive. So you can have, for example, a pavement where people are meant to walk up and down the pavement to wherever their destination is. But as you saw in one of the photos, the shop really expanded onto the pavement. So it caused people to also to move differently, sort of mentally, but also physically, as they make their way around the neighborhood. So I think there's this constant interaction between planners and inhabitants, and an inevitable one where many inhabitants, if the policy restrictions are also not too harsh, that people will adapt their environments to live as they want. and to make them feel safe. So you could also see that in that image of the types of shops that were on the streets. They weren't necessarily Zara and H&M, but they were ones that, again, were familiar to people, where they felt safe. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, I think so. We're getting up to towards the hour mark. Unless there's any other questions, can maybe bring the webinar to an end. I'd like to thank Rebecca again for her presentation, and also to everyone for the interest in today's webinar and the interesting discussion we had after Rebecca's presentation. So thanks for that. Just to say that our next webinar here at EPRC will be on the 6th of November with Madeline Smith and Michael Johnson from the School of Innovation and Technology here at the Glasgow School of Art here in Glasgow, and they will present innovation strategies for system level transformation. So you can always contact us to register for our mailing list and keep up to date on future events. And obviously we hope to see you again, but in the meantime, enjoy the rest of the day, and thanks again.
Thank you everyone for coming, and thank you for your questions and making the time.